They called it the greatest achievement in American history, a ribbon of iron stretching 3,000 miles from the Missouri River to the Pacific coast, two companies building toward each other across desert and mountain and prairie. Meeting in the middle of Utah on May 10th, 1869, with a golden spike and a telegraph message that went out to the entire country simultaneously. Done. The nation connected. The speeches were extraordinary. The photographs were extraordinary. The celebration was extraordinary. Politicians and railroad executives and journalists described what had been accomplished in terms that reached for the largest available language: a miracle, a triumph, the physical manifestation of American destiny expressing itself in iron and will. Nobody mentioned the bodies. Not in the speeches, not in the telegrams, not in the photographs of men in suits standing beside the locomotives at Promontory Summit with their champagne and their self-congratulation. The bodies were not part of the story the country wanted to tell about what had just happened. They were under the tracks, not literally in most cases, but close enough that the metaphor holds. Because the Transcontinental Railroad was built on human lives in a way that the celebration at Promontory Summit was specifically designed to make invisible, and the invisibility is held so well for 150 years that most Americans can tell you about the Golden Spike and cannot tell you about the men who died getting there. This is about the men who died getting there. Stay with me. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 gave two companies the contract and the financing to build the railroad. The Union Pacific would build west from Omaha, Nebraska. The Central Pacific would build east from Sacramento, California. The federal government provided land grants and loans tied to the number of miles completed. The more miles you laid, the more money you received. The more money you received, the more pressure you were under to lay more miles. Speed was not a secondary consideration. Speed was the entire economic logic of the operation. The faster you built, the more you earned. The more you earned, the more you could invest in building faster. And the company that built faster claimed more of the continent, more of the land grants, more of the future revenue that the completed railroad would generate from the traffic moving across it. The men doing the actual building were not shareholders, they were the input. The raw material that the economic logic of the operation processed in the same way it processed iron and timber and blasting powder as a resource to be deployed at maximum efficiency and replaced when depleted. The Central Pacific had a problem.
Labor.
California in the 1860s was not a state with a surplus of men willing to do hard physical labor for the wages the railroad was prepared to pay. The gold rush had drawn people west with the promise of wealth, not wages. The men who had stayed in California after the rush had options. They could farm, they could work in the growing cities, they could find employment in any number of enterprises that were developing as California's economy matured. They could choose. The railroad needed men who couldn't choose. Charles Crocker, the Central Pacific's construction superintendent, solved the problem in 1865 by hiring Chinese workers. The decision was initially controversial within the company. The prevailing assumption among the railroad's management was that Chinese men, smaller in stature than the Irish and European workers who formed the bulk of the Union Pacific's labor force, would be physically inadequate for the demands of railroad construction. Crocker ignored the assumption and hired anyway. What he found was a workforce of extraordinary capability, organization, and endurance. The Chinese workers, most of them immigrants from Guangdong province who had come to California during the gold rush years and stayed when the rush ended, brought with them not just physical capability but the organizational traditions of men who had worked in large coordinated groups on difficult projects for generations. They worked in teams. They managed their own internal organization. They solved logistical problems that their supervisors had assumed would require direct management. they also worked for less than white workers. $26 to $35 a month compared to $35 for white workers, with the additional disparity that the Chinese workers had to provide their own food while white workers had food provided by the company. The railroad had found what it needed. A workforce that was capable, organized, and cheap, and completely without legal protection of any meaningful kind. The Central Pacific eventually employed somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 Chinese workers at the peak of construction. Estimates vary because the record-keeping was not designed to preserve the names and numbers of Chinese workers with any particular accuracy. They were tracked as a labor category, not as individuals. This matters. And because when people died, the deaths of men who existed in the records as a category rather than as individuals are very difficult to count. What we know is that they died. In the Sierra Nevada, where the Central Pacific spent 2 years fighting through mountains that the flat economics of miles per day for dollars had not accounted for properly, the Chinese workers did work that the history of railroad construction had no real precedent for. The Sierra Nevada are not hills, they are a wall rising from the Central Valley floor to peaks above 14,000 feet. The range presented the railroad with a challenge that no amount of money or organizational efficiency could make simple. The tracks had to go over the mountains. The mountains had not been consulted about this. The workers blasted through them, black powder first, and then, as the work progressed into harder granite and the limitations of black powder became apparent, nitroglycerin. The handling of nitroglycerin in the 1860s was not the procedure-governed, safety-conscious operation of later industrial chemistry. It was improvised, dangerous, and lethal with a frequency that the pace of construction absorbed and continued past. Nitroglycerin exploded when it shouldn't have. Men died, sometimes one at a time, sometimes in groups. The records that survive, incomplete, maintained by people whose primary interest was in miles completed rather than casualties, document specific incidents without providing anything like a complete count. An explosion here, a collapse there. The language of the surviving records is matter-of-fact in the way that language becomes matter-of-fact when the events it is describing happen often enough to become routine. The tunnels were the worst. Summit Tunnel was the most difficult single construction challenge of the entire transcontinental project. A tunnel through the granite heart of the Sierra Nevada at 7,000 feet elevation, 1,659 feet long, driven from both ends simultaneously and from a central shaft, sunk from above to create 4 working faces. The workers drilled into granite by hand. 8 hours of drilling to advance 7 inches, 7 inches a day, through one of the hardest rock formations in North America, by hand, by men who breathed the dust that the drilling produced. Granite dust, silica particles small enough to pass through the respiratory defenses and lodge permanently in lung tissue for 8 hours every day. The silicosis that resulted killed men over years rather than instantly, which meant it didn't make the incident reports. The man who died of lung disease 3 years after Summit Tunnel was completed did not appear in any accounting of what the tunnel had cost. The winter of 1866 to 67 buried everything. 40 feet of snow in the Sierra Nevada that winter. The workers who had been living in camps on the mountain were buried with it. The work continued, had to continue. The economic pressure of miles per day for dollars did not pause for weather, but it continued in conditions that reduced the workers' environment to a system of tunnels through the snow itself. Living tunnels, working tunnels, the entire above-ground world replaced by a white maze through which 10,000 men moved for months without seeing the sky. Avalanches came without warning. The sound of an avalanche in the Sierra Nevada is not the sound you imagine if you have not heard one. It is not a rumble that builds and gives warning. It is a crack, often, and then it is already happening, the snow moving at speeds and with forces that reduce everything in its path, trees, structures, people, to the same category of obstacle. Entire work camps were buried. Men were found in the spring, when the snow melted, still holding their tools. How many died that winter in the Sierra Nevada? Nobody counted, not because the number was considered unimportant by any abstract moral standard. Because the men dying were Chinese, and the record-keeping infrastructure of the Central Pacific Railroad was not designed to preserve the deaths of Chinese workers with the same attention it brought to other operational data. The estimates that historians have developed through indirect means, through the records of Chinese community organizations that collected bones for repatriation to China, through the accounts of other workers and supervisors, through the statistical analysis of labor records, suggest hundreds. Some estimates go higher. We don't know. That is the honest answer. We don't know because the people who could have told us decided the information wasn't worth keeping. The Union Pacific had different problems and different bodies. Building west from Omaha across the Great Plains and through the Wyoming and Utah territories, the Union Pacific's primary labor force was Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans, men with experience of hard conditions and limited alternatives who were willing to do difficult work for wages that reflected their limited negotiating position. The pay was better than the Central Pacific's Chinese workers received. The dangers were different, but no less comprehensive. The plains presented a construction challenge that was almost the opposite of the Sierra Nevada, not granite and avalanche, but distance and exposure. The railroad was building across terrain that offered nothing. No timber, no water in reliable quantities, no shelter, no proximity to supply chains that could keep a large workforce fed and equipped. Everything had to come from behind, from the railroad itself, from the supply trains that followed the construction west, and that were the entire logistical foundation of the operation. When the supply trains were delayed by weather, by mechanical failure, by the organizational chaos of managing a moving industrial operation across hundreds of miles of open prairie, the workers at the front felt it immediately and completely. Food shortages, water shortages, equipment shortages. The men at the end of the line, doing the hardest work, were the last to receive everything they needed, and the first to feel any disruption in the supply. The Sioux and Cheyenne nations, whose territory the railroad was crossing, understood what the railroad meant. It meant the end of the buffalo. Not as a future possibility, but as a present reality. The construction crews shot buffalo for food, for sport, for the simple reason that the animals were there, and the men had guns, and nobody in the organizational structure of the railroad was inclined to discourage the killing. Buffalo Bill Cody earned his nickname during this period, killing buffalo to feed Union Pacific work crews. By his own account, he killed over 4,000 animals in 18 months. Multiply that by every hunter feeding every crew along the entire length of the construction. The Plains nations attacked the railroad, not because they were savage or irrational or possessed by the violence that the mythology attributed to them, because the railroad was destroying the foundation of their existence with a comprehensiveness and speed that left no option except resistance or submission, and resistance was the choice that dignity permitted and survival demanded. The Union Pacific responded to attacks on its workers and its infrastructure by requesting military protection. The Army provided it. The soldiers who rode out to protect the railroad construction were operating under orders that gave the Plains nations a narrow range of options, move to the reservations that had been designated for them, or be treated as hostile. Hostile meant what it meant. The violence that surrounded the Union Pacific's construction was not an unfortunate side effect of an otherwise benign project. It was the operational context of a project that was, by design and by the explicit understanding of the men running it, intended to make the plains uninhabitable for the cultures that had lived on them. General William Sherman, commanding the army forces in the region, was explicit about this. He wrote that the destruction of the buffalo was essential to the subjugation of the plains nations, that without the buffalo the cultures that depended on them could not survive, that the railroad's construction and the Army's protection of it were inseparable from the project of clearing the plains for settlement. He wasn't describing a side effect. He was describing a strategy. The workers died from the violence too. Men killed in raids on work camps. Men killed in the skirmishes that the Army's engagement with Plains nations produced in the vicinity of the construction. Men who were building a railroad that was simultaneously a military operation and didn't always survive the military dimension of it. And then there was the work itself. The Union Pacific's construction pace in the final competitive push, when the two railroads were racing each other across Utah, each company trying to lay as many miles as possible before the meeting point was determined, reached speeds that the safety record of the operation reflected honestly. The record for a single day's track laying was set by the Central Pacific in April of 1869, 10 miles and 56 feet of track laid in a single working day by a crew of several thousand men operating with the coordination and intensity of an industrial machine, 10 miles in a day. The human cost of that pace, sustained over weeks and months of the final construction push, was not calculated by the people setting the pace. It was absorbed by the men maintaining it, who had no meaningful ability to slow down or stop or refuse conditions that were killing them at a rate the operation had decided was acceptable for the operation, not for the men. The Golden Spike ceremony on May 10, 1869 was attended by railroad executives, government officials, journalists, and dignitaries. The photographs show men in suits and top hats, champagne, handshakes, the two locomotives facing each other across the gap that the spike would close. The Chinese workers who had built the western half of the railroad were not invited to the ceremony. There is no ambiguity about this. They were not there. The men who had spent 4 years blasting through the Sierra Nevada, who had worked in tunnels under 40 feet of snow, ones who had handled nitroglycerin in conditions that killed some of them and damaged others in ways that would kill them later, those men were not present when the work they had done was celebrated. The Union Pacific's Irish workers were represented in the ceremony in the general sense that some of them were present as part of the assembled crowd. The specific Chinese workers who had made the Central Pacific's construction possible were absent, not accidentally absent. Absent in the way that the record-keeping had been absent throughout, because the organizational and social framework of the project had never included them as participants in the story it was telling about itself. They were the labor. The story was about the achievement. And in the telling of the achievement, the labor was invisible. The Chinese workers who survived the construction dispersed into California and the broader American West. Some formed communities in the cities. Some found work in agriculture and manufacturing and the various industries that the expanding Western economy was producing. Some returned to China. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, passed 13 years after the Golden Spike, prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the United States and denied citizenship to the Chinese already here. The men who had built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad were, a decade after completing that work, legally classified as undesirable and excluded from the country they had helped connect. The railroad they built still runs. The tracks follow approximately the same route. The tunnels through the Sierra Nevada that cost hundreds of lives and years of brutal work are still in use. Freight moves through them today. The infrastructure that the Chinese workers created with hand drills and black powder and nitroglycerin in the 1860s has been maintained and upgraded and is part of the operational backbone of American commerce 150 years later. There is no monument at Summit Tunnel to the men who built it. There was no monument for most of that 150 years. In 2014, the state of California placed a historical marker at the site, a marker for the men who built the tunnel that connected the continent. The golden spike is in the Smithsonian Institution. It has its own display case. The Smithsonian has extensive holdings related to the Transcontinental Railroad. The achievement is well documented. The photographs are preserved. The telegrams are preserved. The speeches are preserved. The names of the Chinese workers who died in the Sierra Nevada are not preserved because they were not recorded. And because the people doing the recording made decisions about what was worth keeping and what wasn't, and the lives of the men doing the work were not, in the accounting of the people running the operation, worth keeping in any detail. The greatest achievement in American history was built on bodies that the achievement celebration was specifically designed to make invisible. The golden spike went in. The telegraph message went out. Done. The nation connected. The speeches were extraordinary. And under the tracks and in the granite of the mountains and in the lungs of men who breathed stone dust for years and died of it quietly and without record, and in the bones that Chinese community organizations collected and shipped back to Guangdong because the men who owned those bones had wanted to be buried at home and had not gotten that either. Under all of that, the real cost, still uncounted, still unacknowledged in any way that corresponds to what it actually was, which was the price of a country connecting itself across a continent, paid by men whose names the country never bothered to learn.